Streetlights are not supposed to turn purple, and when an entire road suddenly glows violet, it feels intentional. Like a city changed the settings, like somebody wanted a different kind of light. But the real answer is stranger than that. Those lights are not changing color on purpose. They are failing in a very specific way. And once you see what is actually breaking inside them, the whole thing stops looking mysterious and starts looking like a nationwide quality problem. A white LED streetlight does not begin as white. Inside the fixture, the LED chip usually starts by making blue light. Then that light passes through a phosphor layer. That layer converts part of the blue into longer wavelengths, and your eyes blend the mix into white. So when a streetlight turns purple, you are not seeing a city choose purple. You are seeing the white-making part fail. That is the trick. The color shift is the evidence. Think of it like white paint peeling off a blue flashlight. The blue source was always there. The coating is what changed how it looked. In these streetlights, the phosphor silicone layer can crack, separate, or degrade. When that happens, less of the blue light gets converted. More of the raw blue-violet light escapes. And because road lights are installed in huge batches, the pattern gets weird fast. You do not just get one purple light. You get clusters, whole stretches of road. An entire city starts looking like it changed brands overnight. That is why this feels bigger than a burnt bulb. Because it is. The myth is that purple streetlights must be a new design choice. Some people assume it helps cameras. Some think it is for energy savings. Some think cities are experimenting. No. A normal roadway light is supposed to produce controlled white light. Purple is not the feature. Purple is the failure. And the obvious question is simple. If they know the light is bad, why not just swap it immediately? Because street lighting is not one bulb over your garage. These fixtures are mounted by the thousands. They are owned by different utilities, cities, contractors, and departments. Some are under warranty. Some require crews, lane closures, bucket trucks, replacement parts, and reporting systems just to change one segment of road. So the fix is obvious. The logistics are not. LED streetlights were adopted for a reason. They use less energy. They last longer. They cut maintenance compared with older lamps. That is why cities pushed so hard to install them in the first place. But that scale created a hidden trade-off. When one old bulb failed, it was usually just one bulb. When a manufacturing defect shows up in a mass LED rollout, the failure can repeat across thousands of identical fixtures. Standardization makes infrastructure efficient. It also makes defects travel farther. That is the real story here. The purple color is not the main event. The main event is what happens when one weak component gets copied into a system at city scale. This is also why the problem seems to appear everywhere at once. Streetlights are bought in large procurement waves. Utilities and cities do not replace road lighting one lamp at a time for fun. They buy fleets of fixtures, install them across large areas, and expect them to behave the same way for years. That is normally a strength. Uniform parts, uniform maintenance, uniform light. But if a bad batch gets into that system, uniformity turns against you. Now the same defect ages the same way in the same product line across the same streets around the same time. That is how a technical defect becomes a visual phenomenon. So when you see a road glowing purple, you are not looking at a mystery. You are looking at infrastructure revealing its supply chain. A streetlight turned into a map of standardization, mass rollout, and delayed failure. And now that you know that, you will notice something else. When a city starts glowing purple, it is not showing off. It is showing you exactly where modern systems break. If you want more small things with big reasons, Subscribe.